Welcome to the fourth event in the 2021-2022 NFUniversity term. I'm Darren Qualman, as many of you will know, and I'm the Director of Climate Crisis Policy and Action for the National Farmers Union, and it's my pleasure to chair the event today. We'll just take care of a few introductory pieces, and we should get to our speakers in 5 or 6 minutes. This is a bilingual event. So if you'd like to listen in French, please go to the bottom of your Zoom screen and click on the globe icon that says interpretation to access French. I'll just get that played in French for you, that announcement.
S'il vous plaît, choisis le globe dans ton menu de Zoom et choisis l'option français pour la traduction. Notez bien que le traducteur vérifie régulièrement dans le chat en français. Si personne n'indique qu'il veut l'entendre en français, il va partir. Donc, si tu veux la traduction simultanée, s'il vous plaît, indique dans le chat. Merci.
Thank you. Just a little bit about NFUniversity. It's a series of twice monthly Zoom webinars that delve deep into the issues to build up our collective understanding and to increase our ability to advocate, to act, and get the policy solutions that farmers need. The classes are held on the second and fourth Thursdays of each month through to the end of April, when we take a break for farming season and through the summer, and then we resume again in the fall. To sign up for upcoming classes or to watch videos of past classes, please go to www.nfu.ca and click on the blue button that says NFUniversity. We've also posted a link to that in the chat. Today, as part of our NFUniversity series, we're pleased to welcome 2 NFU farmer leaders to share with us how grass, grazing, and soil are key parts of profitable whole system agricultural climate solutions. I'll introduce them in a moment. Just a note about using the chat function during today's presentation. The NFU members are very energetic and like to participate and contribute, but we will have lots of time to do that at the end. We'll have 25 minutes for Q&A. We'll have a chance to ask our questions out loud, and then we'll have another 15 minutes for informal discussion and networking. So during the presentation, if you can, just minimize the use of the chat, because it can be distracting to the speakers and some of the other participants. So please minimize that if you can. That said, if you see a technical problem or you need to communicate with the behind the scenes staff, that's a good use for that chat function. I just want to thank the staff and volunteers that help make the NFUniversity series happen. Today, Rebecca McInnes, Heather Beach, Gillian Cormier, Kathy Holslander, Mara Shaw, Mark Messio, and others are doing the behind the scenes technical and support work. And a special thanks to our interpreter, Ronald Fournier. The NFU is pleased to offer this NFUniversity series in both official languages. If you want interpretation for upcoming sessions, be sure to let us know when you register. And please register at least a week before the upcoming session so we can arrange interpretation. A bit about our organization. For those of you who are not familiar with the NFU, we're a grassroots membership organization advocating for sustainable farms and a just food system. We have members all across Canada producing a wide range of crops and livestock on farms large and small using diverse production systems. If you're not yet a member, we invite you to join. We encourage you to join. If you farm, you can join as a voting member. Non-farmers are encouraged to join as associate members. To join, go to nfu.ca. We've also posted a link in the chat. Now I'd like to offer a land acknowledgement on behalf of the NFU. I am in Treaty 6 territory in the homeland of the Métis in what is called Saskatchewan. Treaty 6 includes the traditional territories of the Cree, Saulteaux, Nakota, and Dene peoples. We are being joined today in this webinar by people from across Canada, from the traditional homelands and unceded territories of many Indigenous peoples. The NFU recognizes that Canada is a settler colonial country and that land acknowledgements are only a start, the NFU is moving beyond acknowledgement to action. We invite you to join us in that work in whatever way you can. Before introducing our two speakers today, I just want to say a couple of words about NFU Days. Building our organization and welcoming new members is something that our officials and staff focus on every day of the year. But for 2 weeks each year, membership building is our special focus. NFU Days is our annual membership drive. This year, it runs from January 24th through to February 7th. For those 2 weeks, all memberships for new members are on at half price. This is a great time to sign up a neighbor. So please think of one person in your community and invite them to join our organization. To kick off NFU Days this year, we're holding a training session on union organizing and membership engagement. Please attend if you can. To sign up for that training, please email Rebecca McInnes. We'll post Rebecca's email address in the chat. So here's a schedule for today's session. Our two presenters will speak for a total of 50 minutes. Then we will have 25 minutes for questions and answers from you. Following the Q&A period, we'll keep this Zoom space open for about 15 minutes for informal discussion and networking for those who want to stay. The presentations today will be recorded and posted on the NFU's YouTube channel, though the question and answer session will not be posted. Technicians, please ensure that the recordings are turned on. Now for today's session. Our presenters today are Lydia Carpenter and Paul Slomp. Lydia raises cattle, hogs, and hens with her husband and child in Southwest Manitoba. She's interested in planned grazing and its application for soil health and functional hydrology. She's also interested in farm business management, farm policy, and transition planning. She earned a BSc in Environment Studies and Geography and a Master's in Natural Resource Management from the University of Manitoba. Paul Slomp grew up on a family dairy farm, first in the Netherlands, then in Alberta. These were farms that were at the forefront of grass-based dairy movement. After studying engineering and working with smallholders in Africa, Paul returned to Canada to start his own farm to produce food in ways that regenerate soils and ecosystems. Paul, his partner Jose, their two children, graze cattle and pigs in Southwest Quebec. Lydia, if you'd like to start, please go ahead with your presentation.
Okay, thank you. Rebecca's going to be changing the slides for me, so I'll let you know, Rebecca, when to move on. So I'm sure I know many of you that are on this call today. Just a little bit of background for those of you that I haven't met. My name's Lydia Carpenter, and as Darren said, I farm in Treaty 1, Southwest Manitoba. I farm with my husband and my son. This is an older photograph, 2 years to be exact. We'll have to get another one. But we're first generation, and this is important, I think, in the context of the presentation, because we've really not known any other management systems than managed grazing or planned grazing. We started with livestock about 10 years ago, having come from myself from Winnipeg and my husband from South Africa, though he spent some of his teenage years in Winnipeg as well. We came to farming and we decided to start with livestock, primarily because we didn't own any land. We were leasing land and we didn't have the type of equipment and infrastructure you would use for grain farming. And in addition, we were interested in livestock and direct marketing proteins to people in Winnipeg and Brandon. So we started on about 80 acres of land in Southwest Manitoba, south of Brandon. I wouldn't call it marginal. It was pasture land, perennial pasture, but it was a small farm by most standards on the prairies. And we knew that if we were going to make a start in agriculture, we would have to manage those 80 acres to produce as though they were 160 acres. And we were going to do it not just with sheep. We started with sheep as a small stock, but we had to have additional species for our direct market business. We leased land for about 7 years. After that land lease, we went to another land lease where we worked with a farmer doing custom grazing. This was our introduction to cattle. We had some of our own cattle already, maybe a dozen, but it was really our introduction to working with large numbers of cattle. And this rancher, he was already doing planned grazing using holistic management practices. And so we sort of continued on that path. And that's sort of how we met, because we were interested in similar production models. And then subsequently, we purchased land from another rancher who actually used to be Paul, who's on this, who will be presenting next, Paul's neighbor in Alberta, who moved to Manitoba. And now we live adjacent to each other. We run our cattle together using managed grazing. Okay, so you can go to the next slide. And I'll keep talking while you switch over. So for us, our planned grazing system primarily came about because, one, we were trying to produce very high quality proteins, and we needed to manage the resource to fatten our animals on grass. But also we needed and we wanted to create a profitable operation where we didn't rely too heavily on external feed sources. And so our grazing lands became really important to us through our land leases, but also once we purchased farmland. And I feel a little bit siloed, to be honest. I'm sure everyone feels that way after these past couple of years, in the sense that it's the only type of cattle management I really know. We've never done sort of a set stock system. We've always worked with other ranchers that have been using managed grazing. And now I can see, the benefits of that, because we've worked on all different types of land that had not been managed this way before, land that was more marginal. And after, several years, I'm starting to see the outcomes of that work. As far as the quality of the beef we're producing, but also on some of the more marginal land, just sort of the ecosystem function. And I've written, there's a list here of some of the things that we're looking for when we're using planned grazing. So we're working towards, healthier soils, increased biodiversity, and ecosystem function, or increased ecosystem function. I feel like the ecosystem function should be at the top of the list. I like lists. But that's, water cycle, nutrient cycle, and energy flow. Years ago, my list might have looked a little bit different. I might have had soil organic matter or soil carbon. I might have had, increased grass diversity, and I've changed this list recently. A few of you on the call are probably in this course with me, but we're taking an ecological outcomes verification course that's taught by the Savory Institute. And one of the things that was talked about is how it's farmer focused, but it's also outcomes focused. And I've been to a lot of talks about management, and often I find it, for me personally, I can often get hung up on like a very specific type of production practice, or wanting to do something a very specific way, because I feel like it will help lead to the results that I want. And I like using the term managed grazing because it's not prescriptive. When we're managing our grazing, we're moving our cattle, but we're not talking specifically about, mob stocking or multi-species, or we're just talking about something that's more management intensive, where the animals are moving. And so I like the outcomes focus, because it's a little bit broader and potentially more farmer focused than focusing on very specific measurements of like soil carbon, for example, which can fluctuate. We've been in a drought for the last little while here. So I like the notion of like moving in a direction. And I think that that's where the managed grazing has really helped us from the time that we started farming until now, 10 years later. So if you go to the next slide, a lot of you have probably heard about, obviously, regenerative agriculture. And so this is the source of this, again, was from the training that I'm taking for the ecological outcomes verification from the Savory Institute, looking at, degenerative systems versus sustainable and regenerating systems, where we're restoring soil biodiversity grows and water and carbon is absorbed. And one of the challenges is that some of these things, like soil carbon, for example, or water infiltration, can be lagging indicators. So, you can change your management and you may not see, you might see some results on the land from year to year. Like anyone who's done bale grazing, you notice there are some changes in the landscape. Or when you start, grouping your animals together and moving them, you will see some changes. But some of these other measurable changes happen over time. And I think that's the benefit, for me now being 10 years in using these grazing systems, is we can see on the landscape, increased biodiversity, increased bird species. And having more time at home actually has given me more time, and like all of us more time to sort of observe what's happening, and especially in a drought, able to see some of the benefits of our grazing management. I'm not going to go into depth too much because there's 25 minutes to talk right now. But if you have any questions, as Darren said, maybe, don't use the chat, but jot them down. I'll be happy to answer them afterwards. Okay, so the next slide. So on the ranch, we have, in its entirety, there are probably about 200 cows. We run a grass finishing business. So we direct market grass-fed beef. So there might be 200 cows, but there's multiple animal groups. So there might be 500 to 600 head at any one time. And what we do is we're two farms. Like our farm, we do the direct marketing, and we have cattle, but we run them all together as animal groups rather than us trying to run our cattle and our neighbor Ian trying to run his. We will group together yearlings, for example. We'll group together bulls, and then we'll move them on the landscape, sort of where the feed quality is best for the finishers, for example. So we might have a group, like last year we had a group of yearling heifers on our land, and the majority of those were going to be kept as replacements, and then the grass finishers were on a different quarter where there's higher quality pasture. The photograph just with the fence line there, you can just see we're using an electric wire. Those animals are ready to move. They've got lots of grass in front of them. It's quite tall. I'm not entirely sure how palatable it is, but there's lots of vegetation below, and they're just so used to moving. As soon as they see us come with the quad camera, they're ready to go. And then the next photo there was taken this last season. Those are some of the grass fats, the steers, that were going to be butchered that season. So the next photograph, or the next slide. This was taken this season. So in the drought, our area, right where we are, near the Tiger Hills, we weren't as dry as some areas like the Interlake, but we were in that extreme below average area. This farm that we're on now, so Ian moved from Alberta. He purchased this farm, oh gosh, see, now it's hard to remember, 2015. And when he purchased the farm, it was pretty farmed out. One of the conditions for that purchase was that there would be no animals on it for a whole year before moving. But it was pretty, like in patches, it was pretty bare. So he bought the ranch, then he sold us a portion of it. There were 2 homesteads. So this is our home quarter. So we run cattle, but we also run pastured poultry and hogs. So we have, in this area here, we've been putting lots of nutrients down with our multi-species grazing. And this piece that they're standing on before they graze it, it's rested. It hadn't been grazed that season. This is a bit later, maybe July. But you can see we had a lot of forage, and that's just from stored moisture. We hadn't had a lot of rain. And then the next photograph is we grazed this piece pretty hard. And so you can see that that's kind of the residue that was left after that grazing period. So that's maybe, we may stay a little bit longer, maybe 2 days, and then move them off of that. And that'll rest now for 365 days. So we do what we call a once over grazing. For the grass finishers, we graze it a little shorter so that the quality is a little bit better, but over the whole ranch, we're doing once over, which means we hit it once through the season, and then it has a recovery period of 365 days approximately. So the next slide. Okay. Okay, so the next slide, once it comes up. So like I said, yeah, we do multi-species. So we sort of integrate these other species into our grazing plan. You know, we kind of will do a leader followers, like the hens might come after the cattle once we've had a little bit of recovery on that piece. And we've got the pigs as well. So go to the next slide. And again, so we're running hogs as well. We talk about managed grazing, we're talking primarily about cattle. So I would say that the majority of the revenue from our farm at this point is coming from cattle and beef, to be specific. This system works really well for us, not just because you know, we see a really good return from the land as far as increase. Oh, sorry.
Pigs. It's a nice picture.
Oh, thanks. So yeah, so it's just as far as the farm management goes, you know, we see, oh, sorry, here, 1 second. We see increased revenue from being able to run multiple species on our ranch, but it's not just the, oh, sorry, just give me 1 second. I just lost my train of thought. I'm just gonna check my notes here. Yeah, so it's not just the return from the beef sales or the meat sales. We're also seeing a return in the amount of forage that we're producing, just as far as the way that we think about revenue. And obviously, like, you know, we're thrilled that we can manage the ranch in a way, or the farm in a way, where we're seeing these improved outcomes around biodiversity. Like, we find in particular, like, the increased wildlife really rewarding, but that we can do it profitably is really great. And we're kind of in a unique situation. And I think Paul is sort of in the situation as well, where we're direct marketing almost everything that's produced on the farm. And so we have a clientele and a community that I think appreciates the additional management. And I mean, we market as grass-fed beef, but I often want to say, like, it's bird-friendly beef. And a lot of this comes from the managed grazing. So just being able to give the land a rest, and then being able to run additional species over land that's already been grazed by cattle. It'll be like an additional impact on the land, but it's also increased fertility. So we're feeding these hogs out on the pasture as well. They're a little bit more difficult to manage. That's a whole other talk. But this would be on land that the cattle had already grazed over once. The next slide, please. Okay, so I'll just continue talking while we're switching to the next slide. But the next one is going to show the land. It's a little bit hard to tell, but the top photo was what the land we're on now looked like before it was purchased. It's, you know, you can't really see, but if you just look in the forefront of the photo, you'll see rocks. This was taken in the spring. So to be fair, these photos were not taken at the exact same time of year. But if, you know, walking over it, it was almost like it was dirt and dust, and there's obviously seed bank there. What it really needed was a degree of rest. And the photo on the bottom is taken at the same spot. That shrub is kind of, you know, that's the same bush there. And this is just this is 2 seasons of rest, and had been fed over the winter for 1 season. But I took this photo primarily to show what a certain amount of rest and recovery can do. And that's really what the planned grazing and managed grazing does, is it allows for a certain time of recovery and a degree of forgiveness in the management. So if we overgraze an area because, you know, someone got sick and we couldn't move the cattle, or we really had to be somewhere, there's some sort of family emergency, you know, we can recover from that and adjust our management the following year on that piece of land. And so that's why we're kind of working, like, it'll depend kind of on the time of year, but we're probably moving the cattle like once every 1 to 3 days, depending on the group and how much land and what the forage is like in that spot. Okay, so the next slide. So in the next slide, I've got a few slides that show just kind of, you know, what what winter feeding or running pasture poultry over the land had done. These were just adjacent to each other, a couple of feet. We winter feed our cattle out in the open, and then it's not grazing per se, but we're still moving them because we're moving the feed bunkers and moving the fence so that the nutrient deposition is moving throughout the winter as well. And so this was an area that had winter feeding on it. And in fact, we find that we see like a pretty significant, just because like it's hard for the animals to do damage in the winter when the ground is frozen. They're not grazing, they're not overgrazing per se. You get a high degree of animal impact. There's straw bedding and there's additional feed there. And so this is just an example of what winter feeding out in the open and then moving the cattle can do. The next slide again is just these are right side by side. So this would have been again moving animals. This is probably poultry. And I know we're talking about managed grazing, but I think like the principles in managed grazing are not. It's a little bit easier with cattle, but the principles of movement and rest I think are really critical. And movement and rest can be used in ruminant species, but monogastrics like pigs and poultry as well. So this is just showing, on the left, we had a pasture poultry pen probably for 24 hours. So probably had about 50 pounds of N, and then nothing on the right hand side. So like this is important because it's gonna, like you can see the density of plants is actually a lot higher on the one side. So we're increasing our photosynthetic capacity. So we're increasing energy flow, and we're probably going to be holding more water here as well. I say probably, and that's where the outcomes verification comes from. Like these lagging indicators, like we can measure over time. I think like as farmers and ranchers, we can see we can see change. It's sort of apparent to us from year to year through observation that changes are happening in terms of like measuring some of these indicators. That's maybe where things, where you need more people on board and you have to do that work. And I would say like I'm not a fan of measuring singular indicators. So like looking only at soil carbon, for example. I like the idea of, I would say like over time I've become more of a naturalist. When I was younger, I was probably more of an environmentalist. And it might just be my focus now and the time that I have to observe, and the fact that I'm working with livestock. It's important to me, the idea that we are able to capture additional soil carbon, that we're holding water. Like holding water is critical, and additional carbon in our soils will help us hold more water. But there's other indicators I think that are really important as well. Bird species, for example, just the sounds of the farm, in terms of the insects that are there. Obviously the amount of biomass and the amount of photosynthetic activity that's occurring. Next slide.
Lydia, you've got about 5 minutes left.
Okay, that's perfect. I've got two slides actually. So like I was talking about, I just love spring so much. I love, through the winter, we're managing our cattle, we're moving the cattle. The farm, the quarter section that we're on now, like when we first got here, it had to be all cross fence. So the whole place was cross fence and pipe water was installed. Those were kind of the first two things that were done. Was looking for an adequate water source to make sure we had water that for the cattle and that we could move them adequately, and then cross fencing the place. This is on the home, both of these are taken on the home quarter. It's just like my favorite time of year when you go out and the birds are out. And you can see some of these pastures in the background, like on the left, we've got alfalfa that's kind of in bloom. That'll be resting. Some people are concerned with the managed grazing. They want to get to it before the quality. Like there's issues with managing quality, especially if you're managing finishing cattle, and maybe Paul can comment on that. I know my neighbor Ian would know more about that than I do. But we try, one of the things that we kind of focus on is like allowing things to rest and focusing on trophic levels. So if we're feeling like we're gonna, like we're always balancing, like, do we go over half of the farm twice and like let part of it rest, or do we? So we're always managing those variables. Primarily, like we're managing our goals for the farm, and like we want to keep the cattle healthy and in really good shape. you know, we're very much like, we're focused really on animal welfare first and on making a livelihood. But we don't think that any of this has to be compromised in order to do that. In fact, we feel like focusing on the ecosystem functions enhances our work and adds value for the customer as well. But here, you know, we have a meadowlark and the bobolinks, and we just have so many birds that, you know, that really makes me happy. Okay, next slide. Again, just focusing on outcomes and some of the lagging indicators or things over time. So like looking at, you know, at like soil structures, you know, pollinators, birds, the nest was taken on some of our pasture land, the photograph of the nest and the eggs. And, you know, we've got work to do. Like, I feel like there's a lot of improvements that can be made, specifically with figuring out how to manage like point source water, for example, in drought conditions, multi-year drought. But you know, the way that we've been managing our livestock and moving cattle, I felt like even in good years, we were always managing for a drought. And I feel like it's harder, you know, you're moving the animals, and in really good years, it might be a little bit more forgiving, but I feel like we were fortunate to be managing in this way, especially when we came to these drought conditions. Like, we didn't do too badly. Obviously, like, there's other external costs that have gone up, you know, like grain prices or winter feed or that sort of thing. But in terms of the forage availability on our farm, it has actually increased. And I mean, part of that is because when Ian purchased a place and when we accessed the land, it was not in great shape. So we were probably like understocked at that time and improved over time. So we actually had more forage in the drought than we had when the farm was initially purchased, just because of that alteration in management, just movement and rest, really. And I feel like that was sort of like a really that was a really sort of a brief overview. And so I'll leave it at that, and I'll let Paul present, and then if people have questions, we can continue on there.
Thanks very much, Lydia. That was excellent. That was really good. Thank you so much for that. Paul, if you want to share your screen and begin, please go ahead.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Paul Slomp, and I farm in Western Quebec, somewhere in between Ottawa and Montreal. And yeah, like Lydia mentioned, we basically sell all of the animals that we raise on the farm in the form of meat, and we're really blessed to be surrounded by, you know, upwards of 5 million people within an hour and a half drive of the farm. So in today's conversation, I would really like to, here I'm trying to change the slide. Oh, there we go. Okay. I'll briefly talk about the nuances between grazing and managed grazing, and then really focus in on some of the effects of climate change, and some of the strategies that we can put into place on our farms to become more resilient in the face of these climate change threats. I'll introduce like our grazing team and talk a little bit about what all of us contribute to the farm, and then summarize like some of the basic shifts in management that we can take to become more resilient. The last slide will have my contact information, and I love speaking to people about grazing, so feel free to drop me an email, or preferably just call my cell phone and we can talk. That would be great. So to begin with, I just want to quickly touch base on the difference between grazing and managed grazing. I think, you know, the talk of climate change and carbon sequestration has really become a bit of a fad in the grass-fed beef sector. And so I see a lot of people talking about how they graze and how they're sequestering carbon on their farms. But in reality, when I take a closer look at their farm, I would have some serious questions about whether or not they're achieving any of those outcomes that they're talking about. And the inverse is true as well, where I have people look at what I'm trying to achieve on my farm, and then they'll look at me and shake their head and say, like, you know, we tried that and that didn't work. And, you know, they're probably right. It didn't work. But this is where managed grazing comes in, where it's not so much a specific system, it's more an approach where, you know, we set specific goals, we take the time to observe what our practices, like what changes they bring to our farm, and then based on what we observe, we adjust the plan, and we come up with a new one. So when I think about climate change, there's a lot of talk about you know, the carbon, the greenhouse gas emissions and the greenhouse effect that carbon dioxide is causing, that nitrous oxides, methane, water, that those are all problems in the atmosphere, and by and large that's very true. But I think there's a second piece that is less talked about, and that is like the changes to the hydrologic cycle, where you know, in the last century globally, our land use has changed a lot, from a lot of pasture and plant rich landscapes to landscapes that have been paved over, or landscapes that are being tilled and plowed and being left as bare soil for large parts of the year. And so that brings enormous implications in terms of the amount of water that's available in our soil, the soil surface temperatures, and then all of those have effects on how much rain is going to fall and how much water is available to be absorbed by the sky to form clouds in our general area. And so I think that's also a very important thing to think about when we're talking about climate change and the effects that we face on our farms. So quickly, in practice, I think climate change will cause periods of not enough rain, and most likely periods of too much rain where the soil can't handle the amount of water that falls. Climate change will cause really hot rising temperatures, and there will be times where it's colder than it's ever been on that date. And so these temperature fluctuations. Other things we'll see is a lack of sunlight by just permanent cloud cover, and soil degradation during times of the year when the soil generally doesn't degrade. And one of the things that I really took home from my time in sub-Saharan Africa is that we had a growing season when it rained and a dormant season when it didn't rain. But unlike here in Canada, where, you know, it grows in the summer and in the winter everything shuts down, in places where it doesn't freeze, the soil actually continues to respirate and degrades. And so any gains that you're making during your growing season could be lost in your dormant season just by the soil respirating. And I think we need to be conscious of that, as well as our climate is going to get warmer here. So in thinking about climate change, and in thinking about our current way of practicing agriculture, I really feel like we put a whole lot of expectation in the top 6 inches of our soil to hold water for us, to supply our plants with nutrients when they need them. And we're really working with very little reserve, with very little resiliency, and expecting massive results. And you know, globally during the pandemic, we've seen a massive disruption in supply chains, in manufacture, like the availability of manufactured goods, and this whole just-in-time delivery system globally is kind of falling on its head because it's too vulnerable. And like one tiny delay or one thing in the system that doesn't work leads to an entire system collapse. And I just kind of find it an interesting juxtaposition between where we are in agriculture and realizing that in the face of climate change, we are going to be seeing these delays and potential system collapses in our soils due to either lack of water or due to lack of mineral availability or something like that. And so in light of that, I think we need to start thinking more about how do we build that resiliency in our soil, and how do we start storing inventory for things that we may need later on in our soil. And rather than looking at the soil profile and thinking about topsoil being the top 6 inches, how do we turn the top 2 feet of soil or 1.5 feet, how do we turn that into topsoil so that we can start storing water and storing nutrients that we will need to grow our plants and to feed our cattle and to feed ourselves. So I think there are 4 things that we really need to kind of work into our goals on all of our farms. I put that into my grazing plans. So these 4 things to increase our resiliency are an increased capacity to store water. So increase our soil structure to retain water when it falls, so that it's available much later on when we need it. This will both hydrate the plants, but as I mentioned earlier, it'll also really improve the hydrology of the farm and the farm's ability to cool itself when it's really hot. The second thing that I think we need to do in order to increase our resiliency is to protect the soil microbes, but also protect the soil. So really leave a layer of live grass or live plant matter between the air and the soil, in order to provide that buffer and to insulate the soil from the variations in temperature, but also to prevent the microbes that are living in the soil, prevent them from being exposed to air and exposed to sunlight, which can be detrimental to the activities that they play in the soil. The next thing that I think we need to do a lot more of is to stockpile or build up our grass reserves on our farm. And so the system that Lydia talked about with the once over grazing is a great way to do that. In the system that I run, the amount of times we hit a paddock in a year is variable. We're slowly decreasing it. A few years ago, we did 7 rotations. This year we did 5, and I think next year we're aiming to do 4 rotations. But what I want to highlight here in this picture is that on the left-hand side, you see like bare pasture. There's no grass left. In the middle, where the cattle are, there's probably about 50% of the forage is remaining. And then on the right side of the picture, you see the forage stand that these cattle would have gone into when they started grazing. And so when I look at the grass stand that's here, I think the stage that the grass is at right now, where the cattle are, this is where we should stop our grazing. There's still enough leaf matter there to continue capturing sunlight and to continue growth. And I'll get to this a little bit later, but it will regenerate a lot more quickly if we let this rest for a month or 2 months, as opposed to letting it get down to how it is on the left-hand side, where it might take 2 months to 3 months to recover before we can put the cattle back into it. And then the fourth thing that I think we really all need to consider is like, how do we, like, what role can our farms play in carbon capture? So with those kind of strategies in mind, or things that we need to improve on our own farms: the capturing water, the protecting of the soil, the building up a forage reserve, and the carbon capture. I look closely at like our grazing dream team. So our grazing system is made up of forages, so grasses and legumes, forbs, like you see in the top left-hand corner, the soil microbes, which you see below that, the livestock, which on our farm is mainly cattle. We also have hogs, but we mainly do our pasture management with our cattle. And then myself as the manager. So when we look at the main kind of scientific process that feeds that whole system or keeps it in place, it is photosynthesis. And what we're looking for from our grass plants is to have as much of a solar panel out there as possible to capture as much of the CO2 out of the air and turn it into glucose. And that glucose is then stored in leaf form, which is the canopy, to capture more solar energy. It's stored in the roots, but it's also secreted into the soil through the roots as root exudate. And one of the fascinating things about grass, of course, is that they can't move. So where the seed fell, that's kind of the habitat that it has to live on and to feed itself from. And so in order to access the things that aren't right at that specific location where it's growing, these plants, through trading the sugars that they have readily available, acquire everything else that they need to live. And they trade that sugar liquid with the soil microbes. And so the soil microbes provide the entire communication and transportation infrastructure in the soil to get the plants what they need and to get themselves what they need. And the reason they do this is because they really want to eat that sugary liquid. And so we need to kind of think about the soil around the roots of our plants as like a very busy marketplace bazaar, and the currency that's doing all the moving and shaking in that soil is liquid carbon. So in order to support that work of transportation and communication that these microbes do, they build a very robust infrastructure, and they do that by improving soil structure. And this improved soil structure, of course, is how we can really enhance the sponge abilities of our soil so that we can hold water and hold carbon and hold nutrients. It's all due to this improved soil structure. So the microbes also play enormous roles in cycling of nutrients between air, ground, and plant. I won't go too much into the details for that. So then the question kind of becomes, how do we manage our above the ground grasses in a way that we maximize the activity below ground? And so what you see here is kind of a diagram that shows the increasing maturity of a grass plant from left to right. On the left-hand side, you'll see the early stages where the plant is really focused on supporting itself and self-preservation. On the extreme right-hand side, you see the reproductive stages of the plant, where it's focusing on producing seed and future generations. And in this place where the rapid growth, or the grass growth rate, is circled in red, that is where the photosynthesis happens. And so we, in our grass growth, and as managers, are really aimed at hitting this spot in the middle, maximizing our grass growth. That's where the maximum amount of photosynthesis takes place. So we're aiming to hit our cattle sometime on a plant, sometime in that middle stage. when you combine that with research from the late 70s, which shows that how much of the grass plant we remove actually has an enormous impact on what happens to that root growth, we see that from that research that if you remove up to 50% of the foliage, there's no change in the root growth of that plant. But as soon as you start taking off more than 50%, you start seeing root die back in order to regenerate that new foliage growth. So when you combine that with the previous slide, we know that we need to graze our plants sometime before they go to seed to maximize photosynthesis. And in order to maximize that root growth, we need to not remove more than 50% of the foliage. And in terms of grazing, the tool that we use to do that are our livestock, which are really a great tool for pruning. And, you know, it's not just cattle, it's other livestock too. And we can choose some combination of pruning and trampling as well. Cattle also bring a lot of fertility to the farm and tend to move fertility from fertile regions to non-fertile regions. And, you know, in this rumen, there's a lot of microbial activity as well. And those microbes in the rumen are actually very similar to the microbes in the soil. And so a lot of this manure that is being spread by the cattle also inoculate the soil with microbes.
Paul?
Yeah.
You've got 5 minutes.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So the last function, of course, for the cattle is that they basically provide the meat and the milk that allow us to pay for continuing these environmental services. Then when I ask myself what my role is as a manager, it is first and foremost to really understand what these natural processes are, and to be attuned enough to them to know whether or not we're working with these natural processes or against them. And there's some very specific decisions that we need to make that affect the whole system. Like, when do I put cattle on this piece of grass? When do I take the cattle off? How long do I let this field rest before we bring them back? So in terms of my management, I tried to bring together all of these pieces. I tried to come up with the goals, and then I want to observe what happens when I make certain management decisions, and then replan if it's not going in a direction that I'm hoping. The longer I do this, the more often I am seeing signs of previous management decisions that I took where I really should have made different decisions, and I could have made different decisions if I would have been more attuned to the grass and the cattle and what they were trying to tell me. One of the really great examples about that is shown in this picture here. When you put cattle out in a pasture, one of the first things that cattle will do is they'll go and start grazing, but they don't go up to a grass plant and then, you know, start eating from the top down. They'll take one bite from that plant, and then they'll take a step and they'll take a bite from the next plant. And if you observe a herd, they'll take one bite off every plant before they'll ever go back to a plant a second time to get a second bite, which, like, the cattle are experts. They know that they shouldn't be taking more than 50% off the plant. And if I'm attuned as a manager, I will recognize the point where the cattle will need to come back for a second bite. And at that point in time, I know it's time to move them to a new paddock. And if we manage our grazing that way, we can kind of start building up massive biomass reserves and forage reserves in our pastures. If you look at the first grazing on the left-hand side here, above the black line is what we are allowed to harvest. That's about 50%. So if we take 50% off and give a rest period, by the time we come back for grazing period number 2, we see that we've increased the maximum height of the forage. It's taller than it was in grazing number 1. But what's also happened, like when you prune a plant at the top, it tends to produce shoots out sideways. And so between grazing 1 and grazing 2, a bunch of new shoots have been produced out sideways, and we're actually starting to see our grasslands become more dense, so that by the time we get to our 3rd grazing, the grass is a lot taller than it ever was, but it's also a lot denser. And so what we're doing with this type of grazing is we're able to feed our livestock, but at the same time, we're able to stockpile a whole bunch of feed, which means that, like, if we're only taking 50% at each grazing, it means that I have enough feed stockpiled ahead of me to last for another rotation. So if it stops raining today, it means that I have another month or 2 months in my system to make decisions to acquire feed before I end up in a crisis point. So I'm building up a lot of resilience there. So as we are grazing and we're trying to fine-tune all of these systems, I really hope that we on our farm are moving away from using the reserves in the top 6 inches of soil to a system where we are building up massive amounts of root reserve and building up massive amounts of topsoil in order to store water and have a healthy ecosystem that can continue to feed our cattle going forward. I have one slide left here, which is about carbon sequestration. I'll quickly just say that I think there is enormous potential in carbon sequestration in the soil. I think we need to look beyond the top 6 inches of soil and start thinking in terms of 2 feet of topsoil. But I also think that we need to be very careful, because that carbon that we store in that top layer of soil is easily lost as soon as we change our management practices. So I think there's opportunity there, but I think we need to proceed with caution. Here is my contact information. I love speaking about this stuff. I think about it a lot. Yeah, I look forward to hearing what your questions are. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul, for that excellent presentation. And thank you, Lydia, as well.